Okay, welcome everyone to the Texas Master Naturalist Coastal Prairie chapter monthly chapter program meeting. Today is April 1st, 2021, and we have the distinct honor of having Dr. Scott Solomon present tonight. One thing we just found out before the meeting, though, is he only presents in Russian. So if you don't speak Russian, you may want to log out now. I'm kidding. So with that, I'll turn it over to our Master of Ceremonies and our program director, Mr. Gary Moore. Gary?
Okay, so for the two people that are left, uh, tonight I would like to welcome Dr. Scott Solomon. The topic of his presentation is the wisdom of ants. Dr. Solomon teaches ecology, evolutionary biology, and scientific communication as an associate teaching professor at Rice University. He is also a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. He has a PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Texas at Austin, where his research examined the evolutionary basis of biological diversity in the Amazon basin. He has taught field biology at Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Gothic, Colorado. Dr. Solomon, his current research examines the interaction between native and non-native ants, the impacts of extreme flooding on ant communities, ant foraging behaviors, and the co-evolution between ants and microbes. That's kind of an interesting area. I could go on with his list of accomplishments and activities, but I won't, since we only allowed 1 hour for his presentation, and the list is very long. So let's please welcome Dr. Solomon.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back speaking with this group. I've had an opportunity to visit with this group before, and as I recall, we ended up spending part of the presentation out in the parking lot looking at fire ant mounds growing in the in the soil near the parking area, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you. And so basically what I'd like to do today is to share a little bit of information about ants, as you heard, which have been the subject of most of my research over the last 20 years. I want to give you a little bit of background about ants themselves for those that might be a little bit less familiar with them. And then I'll talk about a few examples of different types of ants that I just find personally fascinating because of some of the things that they do, some of their behaviors, some aspects of their biology. Some of those will be ants from the region here that we live in Southeast Texas. Some of them will not. So I'll try to clarify when I'm talking about local ants versus non-local ants. And then I'll talk about a few different examples of some of the research that I've been doing recently related to ants. But throughout all of that, what I hope I'll be able to impart on you is this idea that ants somehow seem to possess this just kind of mysterious type of wisdom, if you will. The ants are able to do things that in many cases we think of as being unique to humans. And that's one of the reasons that I've been fascinated by ants, and I think why many people are drawn to ants, whether it's just as a kid just watching ants crawl across the sidewalk or across the kitchen counter, or those of us that end up spending their research career studying them in more detail. In many ways, ants, I think, remind us of ourselves, and yet sometimes they do things in ways that maybe we can learn a lesson from the way that ants do. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So, there's a lot of references to ants in different cultures throughout history and across the world. And that includes references in the Old Testament of the Bible, right? So in Proverbs, King Solomon says, "Look to the ant, consider her ways and be wise." And this is a reference to the observation that ants are always out collecting food and planning ahead for the future, and and that allows them to make it through times in which there might not be enough food, and what an important lesson that is. Later there's Aesop's fable of the grasshopper and the ant, in which along the same lines the grasshopper is busy singing all summer long while the ant is collecting food, and then come wintertime the grasshopper doesn't have any food, comes to the ant, and the ant's like, sorry, you should have been, shouldn't have been wasting your time singing. You should have been working hard and planning for the future. And so anyway, so ants, have been, just looked to over many, many years, and again, across different cultures, for the lessons that they might be able to offer us. I'm going to start off here by just giving a nod to the photographer that's behind many of the beautiful images I'll be showing you. This is Alex Wild. He is an ant biologist and a very accomplished photographer at University of Texas, and his website has a lot of great images of ants. I'll have a slide at the very end where I'll direct you to those images, but also other information about ants if you'd like to do a deeper dive. So in general, ants are a group of insects that belong to the order Hymenoptera, which includes also the bees and the wasps. And actually, if we look at the evolutionary history of ants, we can see that they're actually a modified group of wasps. So ants are just this bottom lineage right here. And what's shown here is a large group of these different Hymenoptera. The red lineages are the lineages that have evolved a sociality, a social form of life where they live in a colony with a queen and workers and whatnot. So as you can see, that has evolved multiple times independently within the Hymenoptera. And the closest relatives of the ants are another group of wasps that also includes the bees, which are also social. But we also know that there are solitary wasps. Many different groups of wasps are solitary and not social. So this aspect of ant biology, that sociality, that's so central to why many of us find them fascinating and many of the interesting behaviors. That's certainly not unique to ants. There's another group of insects, the termites, of course, that are also social, right? And that's a totally different group of insects, more related to cockroaches, actually. But all ants are social. And so that is something that evolved apparently in the common ancestor that led to the ants, and has been retained in all of the different, roughly 15,000 species or so of ants that we know about. So some basic ant biology, you'll all be familiar with some of this, I'm sure, but I just want to kind of walk through it so that some of the other things I'll talk about will make more sense, hopefully. What you're looking at here is a picture of a queen leafcutter ant. This is Atta texana, which is a species, as the name suggests, that we have right here in Texas, and in fact in the Houston area. We were just talking beforehand about some places nearby where you can go and see these, and I'm sure many of you have before. I'm going to talk a lot about leafcutter ants because it's one of the groups that I've focused on a lot in my work. But what I wanted to highlight here is just the difference between the size of the queen and the size of one of the worker ants, as you can see here. There's just this absolutely enormous size difference between the queen and the worker. That's not true of all ant species. The difference or size polymorphism, as we call it, between the queen and the worker is something that varies across ant species. This is one of the more extreme species in terms of how different they are in size. And this isn't actually even the smallest size worker. They get even smaller than this. One of the things that this reflects is that the queen in this case can live a very long lifespan, 20, 25 years or longer. We don't really know what the upper limit of the lifespan is of queens, but we know from observing their nests that the nest can persist for 25 years in some cases. And we don't think it's possible for this species for a new queen to take over once the original queen dies. So in terms of the development of ants, right, they go through a typical development life cycle of a complete development in insects, or holometabolous insects, which is to say that they start off as a larva, well, start off as an egg, which then develops into a larva. The larva goes through several molts, getting larger and larger, and then eventually forms a pupa. So in some ant species, the pupa is encased in a cocoon, and so just looks like a jelly bean, basically. And in many other species like this, species of pseudomyrmex, it's not encased, and so you can see it. And so if you can look at the pupa, if you can look at the brood here, the immature ant, and kind of see all the different body parts folded up, like here's the eye, right? You can recognize that it's a pupa, and sometimes you can tell what type of ant it's going to emerge into. This is a pupa that is about to emerge as an adult worker ant. Now, interestingly, in ants and bees and wasps, they have a very interesting form of sex determination, and that is related to the observation that all of the worker ants in the colony are female. So the queen, of course, is female. She's the one that is responsible for reproduction and laying all the eggs in the colony. So this is a queen here. This is a carpenter ant, Camponotus. You can see she's got wings, right? So that's because she's going to leave the nest for her nuptial flight, her mating flight, encounter a male, and then mate, and then go and establish a nest. And when she does that, she'll actually remove her wings. So the wings are only present for that one basically event in her life, and it's, takes place over just a few hours. So the queen is female. All of the workers are female. The males are, this is a male, the males are only present typically for brief periods of time when these nuptial flights are going to take place. And the queen can actually control whether males are present in the colony or not, because sex is determined in ants, bees, and wasps by whether or not the eggs are fertilized. So in most species, including humans, right, sex is determined, not most species, but in humans and many other species, sex is determined by chromosomes, right, the X and the Y chromosome. That's not the case at all in the hymenopteran insects. Rather, the sex is determined by whether or not an egg is fertilized. So a fertilized egg will always develop into a female in these insects, whereas unfertilized eggs, which in humans and many other species wouldn't be able to survive at all, in ants, bees, and wasps, they do survive and they become male. So they actually only have half of the copies of the genes that are present in females. So it's this really kind of interesting and kind of weird sex determination system. But as a consequence, you have these entirely female-dominated societies. So you've got the queen and all of these female workers. The males are just around, again, when it's basically time for the nuptial flight. They don't really do anything useful in the nest, and they leave, they mate, and then they die, and that's it. That's the life of the male ants. So it really truly is a female-dominated society. So, I'll have a few slides throughout where I just want to kind of pause and just point out that, it's remarkable that ants do some of the things that they do. And one of them is that they have these complex societies, right? So it's not only a female dominated society, but it's a society that has a division of labor. On the one hand, you've got the queen, whose job is just reproduction. She does not, contrary to the way they're always depicted in movies and stories, the queen is not directing the ants, the worker ants, and telling them what to do or dig over here or go get more food. Not at all. In fact, there is no leadership hierarchy within social insect colonies. And so it's one of the things that is so mysterious to us, because we just can't imagine having kind of an organized group of individuals that doesn't have a leadership hierarchy. That's not the way human societies are made up. And yet ants, as we'll see, are able to accomplish incredible tasks without having that leadership hierarchy. But even within the worker ants, there often is a division of labor in which certain types of workers specialize on certain types of tasks. For example, some might be more specialized on finding food, others might be more specialized on caring for the young, and yet others might be more specialized on colony defense. We'll call them soldiers. So all of that takes place within these ant societies, but without any central governance or hierarchy taking place. The nests of ants are also just remarkable, to me at least. I'm amazed by the types of structures that they're able to create in order to house their colonies. And so here's one example. These are weaver ants. So this is not a species that we can find in our area. They're found in Africa and Asia and Australia, but they're just amazing. They make these nests out of cavities that they create by taking leaves, as you can see in this picture, and binding them together, basically gluing the leaves together using silk, basically like a spider web, right? By binding these leaves together and then using the hollow interior as a place to rear their larvae. And the way that they make this silk is fascinating. It's not the worker ants themselves that are producing the silk. It's actually the larvae that produce the silk from their mouths. And the worker ants hold on to the individual larvae and move them around like as if they were using a paintbrush to apply the sticky silk to the leaves. And then that's how they get these leaves to bind together. They'll also link their bodies, the bodies of the workers together to form a bridge to be able to pull two leaves together that would be too far apart for any one ant to do on its own. So just remarkable. Here's a species of ant that lives in Central and South America, and this is another species of pseudomyrmex. We have this genus in Texas, but not this particular species. They make nests inside the hollow thorns of acacia trees, and this has become a really famous example of a mutually beneficial relationship between ants and plants, of which there are many examples. This is kind of a famous one. The acacia trees have these hollow spines, and what the ants do is they just dig a little hole to make a little entrance here into one of the spines, and then they can have their nest inside. This is helpful for the ants because they've got a nice place to rear their young. But the ants also benefit from the plant because the plant provides these ants with food directly. It provides a carbohydrate in the form of extrafloral nectar. So a lot of plants encourage ants to come onto them by giving them a sugar reward. And the idea is that by doing that, they will encourage the ants to defend the plant from any potential herbivores, right? The ants are just defending their food source. But what's actually happening for the plant is that they've basically hired mercenaries to be their guardians, because that means that if there's a caterpillar or a grasshopper or something that lands on this acacia tree, the ants are going to quickly attack it. And they are really ferocious in doing that. They have a pretty strong sting. But anyway, the nest here is relatively simple, but it's a good place for these ants to live. Speaking of simple and small nests, there are some like this temnothorax, which is a local species that we have here, that make their entire nest inside an acorn. So these ant nests don't have to be large. You can have an entire society living literally just inside an acorn. And in fact, many times when we see acorns lying around on the ground, they actually do have ants and many other types of insects living in them. There's a quick way you can find out, by the way. If you put an acorn in some water and see if it sinks or floats, that'll tell you whether it's hollow or not. And if it's hollow, chances are good it's got some kind of bug in there, or it did recently. If it sinks down to the bottom, it's probably real dense and doesn't have anything living in there, or at least not much. There's the other side of the size spectrum though as well. This is what a nest of leafcutter ants can look like. This is a species that we don't have here in Texas, but our local Texas species of leafcutter ant can look very similar to this as well. This is a picture that was taken actually by my late father-in-law, who was my field assistant on this particular expedition, which is a whole other interesting story for another time. But this is a picture taken in a pine plantation in Venezuela, and it's a species called Adelaide vigata that I just thought this nest was just absolutely beautiful as an example of ant architecture. So we dubbed this one the Taj Mahal. But just to clarify, this is one ant nest, right? So there's an entire network of tunnels and chambers underground inside of this nest that can extend down for a good 25, 30 feet underground and can extend across. I mean, the diameter of one of these nests can also easily be, 20 or 25 feet across. So it really is like having an entire city of ants, and they can, consist of 5 or 7 or so million different ants. Nobody actually has has counted every single one in a large leafcutter ant nest. As you can imagine, it would be a tough task. So there's all different types of ways that people have tried to estimate the complete size in terms of the number of individuals, but it's easily in the millions. So ants are accomplished architects. And one thing that's interesting is that each species has its own particular architecture. If you go from one nest to another of the same species of ant, you're going to find a pretty similar structure to the way that the nest is built. And again, there's no leadership hierarchy. The ants aren't using blueprints. There's no construction foreman to say, dig more over here, dig less over there. So somehow ingrained into their instincts is the information about what their nest is supposed to look like. And they achieve the construction of that nest by working together. So it's really remarkable. This is another cool example, and I don't want to show this video now, but I'm going to include the link in here in case anybody wants to go back and watch it later. So for now, you'll have to take my word on it. But this is an ant that actually can glide and control its descent if it falls out of the trees that it lives in. So cephalotes ants are ants that live in the tree canopy in tropical rainforests in Central and South America. And if they fall out of the tree that they live in, their chances of finding their way back to that exact same tree are pretty low, right? They use chemical pheromone trails to orient and find their way back, and so that they will have lost the ability to do that. And often they also live in areas that flood periodically. So if you fall into the water, well, forget it, right? You're fish food. So so what's happened is they've evolved the ability to not just fall straight down, but to actually control the direction that they go, and they actually can glide. So if you watch this video, what you'll see is somebody dropping one of these ants, looking straight down, and it takes it like a J-shape trajectory. So it actually returns to the trunk of the tree that it came from. And the mechanics of this are fascinating and still not very well understood, but they go backwards, so abdomen first. And they don't have wings or any other structures that look like what you would expect from gliding animals, like flying squirrels or something like that. So it's really kind of amazing that they can do this, but they do. And actually now we know that there are several other species of canopy dwelling ants that also can glide like this. Some species of ants, including some in our area, some in this genus, in fact, have jaws, mandibles, that are basically like mouse traps. So the mandibles here are sticking out at 180-degree angle. And if the prey item here, this little cricket, if it touches one of these little thin hairs that are projecting out from the mouth of the ant, that will cause these jaws to snap shut. And so that's effectively the mousetrap mechanism here. This is now known to be one of, if not the fastest movement in the animal kingdom. So this is an absolutely lightning fast response. It doesn't involve any neural processing. It's just an automatic thing. Touch the trigger hair, jaws snap shut. So it's really a very effective hunting tool. They also use it as a type of defense, because if you if the ant snaps its jaws against a hard surface or even just against the ground, it's got so much force that it actually propels the ant backwards. It flings itself, and so it can use that to get away quickly from a threat. Here's a group of ants that have actually figured out a way to set a trap and to ambush their prey. So here we're looking at a grasshopper of some sort, a nymph, that is walking up the trunk of a tree, except the trunk of the tree has been covered by a mat of fungus. And these little dark circles here are holes in the mat of the fungus where the ants are going to stick their heads out. And if we look at a close-up of what that looks like, here's the mat of fungus, here's the ants sticking their heads out through these holes. So what they've done is they've created this trap where any insect like this one that walks across the surface here, the ants will quickly grab onto its legs and immobilize it. And then the other ants will be able to come out and attack it and pull it apart and eat it. So this always reminds me of the old whack-a-mole game, if you if you're familiar with that, right? The ants pop their heads out, and I don't think the poor grasshopper has a mallet to start whacking them, but it's a pretty ingenious way of finding your food. And this is an Amazonian species, so again, not one that we have here. Another sort of famous group of ants are the army ants. And so they get the name army ants from the raids that they carry out. We do have some species of army ants that are actually found in Texas, but most of them live underground, so they're not the species that we commonly see. There are more of them as you move out west, for example, into the deserts of the desert Southwest. But this species here is found in Central America. And you know, their reputation is justified. They just absolutely decimate any type of prey that they can find, and that includes things that are often much larger than them. So similar to the ants that we just saw setting a trap, these ants can pull apart prey that is, you know, quite large, including small vertebrates like lizards and even, you know, baby birds and things like that. People know to get out of their way too, right? So if you live in an area where there's army ants and the army ants come into your house, most people just move. Not permanently, but they'll leave. They'll, you know, go away for the weekend. Let the ants kind of have their run of the house, and when you come back, all the cockroaches and all the other bugs in your house are gone. So it's a great form of natural pest control. And I can tell you from having experienced this myself, like there's almost nothing that can stop them. So that's really the best approach, is just get out of their way, let them do their thing, and then thank them for their service when you get back. This is what the soldier caste within this particular species of army ants looks like. So they have these enlarged heads and these jaws. These are their mandibles here, that they can't even use this for feeding themselves. They have to be fed by the other workers. This is just meant to basically impale itself into the flesh of any enemies. And I've had one of these on my leg before. You have to literally pry them off. You can't just flick them or something like that. They also sting. So this is just, you know, step one is insert these mandibles into your skin, and then they start to sting you. And again, you got to really work hard to get them off. And if you're an animal that doesn't have fingers for prying them off, if you're an anteater or something, you're going to be hard pressed to get rid of these. Here's a species that is really impressive, going back to what King Solomon had to say about considering the ways of the ant and how it stores food. So what you're looking at here is a view inside the nest of a honeypot ant. These live in the southwest deserts of the United States. This big yellow ball here is actually the abdomen of these worker ants. It's a specialized caste called repletes. And what they do is they don't leave the nest. The other workers go out and they forage, and they'll collect, you know, extra floral nectar or something from plants, fill up their stomachs, come back to the nest, and regurgitate that nectar into the mouths of these worker ants, and their abdomens just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So they're literally living food storage vessels. And the idea is that if at some point in the future there isn't a lot of food available, these worker ants will then regurgitate that food back to all of the other ants in the colony. So this is taking the place of like having pottery, you know, or a pantry, right? Because they're literally living food storage vessels. So we're not the only ones, right? That's the point. So ants are, at least some species of ants, do in fact do what King Solomon said and store food away for the future. I've talked a little bit already about leafcutter ants, but as I mentioned, this is a group that I've spent a lot of time working on. So I'll say a little bit more about leafcutter ants. So of course they get their name from the fact that they cut leaves, and you can see one here doing that. They are very good at slicing through leaves. Their mandibles actually contain zinc, so they're very, very strong and very sharp. and they'll actually vibrate their bodies as they're cutting. And so it functions like a jigsaw, basically, as they're slicing through these leaves. If you watch them do it, it's really amazing. It looks so simple that they're slicing through these leaves, but that's part of the way that they're able to do that. So they will then carry these leaf fragments back to their nests along foraging trails, which in some cases look like highways. I mean, they've actually cleared a path here that is so evident that if the ants aren't even there, you can tell that this is an ant highway. So sometimes when I've been looking for ant nests, I'll just be walking along somewhere and I'll see one of these ant highways. It's like, all right, well, we just follow that back and eventually it's gonna lead to the nest if you're going the right direction, right? And I'll have more to say in a little bit later about some of the interesting behaviors that they engage in related to carrying these leaves back home. But they're not eating the leaves, right? And so that's an important thing to recognize. What they're doing is they're bringing these leaves underground into the giant nest that I showed you a picture of earlier, into one of several hundred of these chambers underneath the nest in which they are growing fungi. So what these ants are doing is they are taking those bits of leaves, cutting them up into smaller and smaller bits in a sort of an assembly line fashion. They'll pass the leaf on to another worker who will process it further and eventually incorporate it into this ball fungus. And so what the fungus is doing, and you can see here in this photo, that's a little better sort of a close-up, that the white strands here are the actual fungal tissue. You can see the green bits of leaf here. And these fungi have the digestive enzymes to break down the lignin and the cellulose in the leaves. The ants can't do that themselves. So the ants cannot eat these leaves themselves. They are relying on the fungus essentially as an external digestive system to allow them to access the energy and nutrients inside of those leaves. And these fungi have actually evolved to be dependent on the ants in order to survive. So it's actually an example of domestication. So these ants are engaging in a form of agriculture in which they have domesticated their crop in a way that is very similar to the way that we humans have domesticated many of our crops. And by that, what I mean is both that the fungus isn't capable of living on its own anymore, but also that it has been modified to enhance its edibility and its suitability as a crop to the ants. One of the ways in which it does that is seen in this photo here, where the tips of the strands of fungi are enlarged and swollen. And you only see this in the fungi grown by leafcutter ants. This is a structure called the gongolidia, and these are absolutely packed with nutrients. And this is the main structure that the ants are going to harvest and eat. So ants are accomplished farmers, and very much so, because they've actually been engaging in agriculture for at least 50 million years. Between 50 and 65 or so million years, ants have been engaging in agriculture. So, this is an area where I do think we actually have a lot that we might be able to learn from ants. One example is that ants have figured out ways to solve the problems of pests and disease, which we too face in our agriculture, right? We're constantly having to apply pesticides to try to keep, plant diseases and plant pests at bay. The ants deal with this problem as well. So here's an example of a nest on the right that has been absolutely ravaged by a specialized fungal parasite. So it's another type of fungus that attacks the fungus that the ants are growing, and it's called Escovopsis. And when this happens, the fungus crop will be lost, and this ant colony will almost certainly die. So the ants, of course, are very sensitive to this, and they've evolved a lot of ways to try to get around that. And so one of those involves basically encouraging the growth of bacteria on their exoskeleton. So this ant here looks like it's all covered in white. The white is literally bacterial growth that's so dense that you can see it with the naked eye. But it's not an infection in any sort of a negative sense. They're actually encouraging the growth of bacteria by having specialized areas on their exoskeleton that are actually fed by glands that seem to be producing substances that encourage bacterial growth. And then those bacteria are actually producing antibiotic compounds that keep that Escovopsis parasite at bay. So, you know, we again thought we invented antibiotics for the use of, you know, of treating diseases, and we thought that we invented not only agriculture but also the use of pesticides. And yet, what we see is that ants have been doing this for many millions of years before we came along. So, just tell you briefly about some of the research that I've done recently related to these ants, and this is a picture of some of the colleagues of mine and collaborators that have worked on this particular project with me. Many of them, as seen here, out in the field doing their thing, digging into nests of ants or getting stuck in quicksand along the banks of a river. Anyway, this work's always a lot of fun. It's one of the things that I love about doing this type of research, but it is a lot of work. Here's a map of the different samples that we collected, many of them collected from the field, in some cases from museum samples. And in this study, we were interested in understanding the evolutionary origins of the leafcutter ants. So what we did is we looked at their closest living relatives, which is another group of fungus-growing ants in a group known as Trachymyrmex, formerly known now as Trachymyrmex, because the result of our work was to revise the taxonomy of the group. What you see is that the nests of this group of ants is much simpler. They're much smaller, much more modest, much easier to dig because they're just usually kind of a few centimeters or maybe a foot or so underground. So a lot easier to access than digging into one of those giant leafcutter ant nests. So what we actually found is that rather than being just one genus of ants, this is actually 3 different genera of ants. And so we suggested a new name for 2 of those ant genera, and one remains the same. It's actually the North American group, Trachymyrmex, that remains the same. And the reason it remains the same is it's the original, it contains the species that was first described using this genus name, so it gets precedence. So we have, for example, a species called Trachymyrmex septentrionalis, which is a common fungus-growing ant in our region, and that still is the name of that species. But these other groups here, we gave new species names, and most of those occur in Central and South America. But we also, through this project, discovered what we think are at least 11 new species of ants. I think that just highlights, I don't think there was anything special about this work. I think it just highlights how much undiscovered diversity there is within ants and really within insects more generally. And that's especially true in the tropics. At the same time, we were able to get some new insights into the ways that the ants and the fungi that they cultivate have co-evolved together over their long evolutionary history. So, you know, these are not a random group of fungi that these ants cultivate. It's a specific lineage. And the queen ant actually takes a piece of fungus with her when she leaves on her nuptial flight and uses that to seed the new nest. So these ants have been, you know, doing this for millions of years, and that's resulted in this tight co-evolutionary history. Another project that I've worked on recently related to leafcutter ants is a really fun one, and it's one that started in kind of an interesting way. I was actually having lunch on the Rice campus one day and ran into someone I know from campus, and she introduced me to a visiting guest who happened to be a physicist from the University of Costa Rica, and he started to tell me about his work, and I hadn't had a chance to say anything about what I do yet. And he said that, you know, he's a physicist, but he's really interested in these applied problems, for example, of like what causes traffic jams to happen on highways. And he said that he had read somewhere that ants don't have traffic jams, and he was really fascinated by that idea, wanted to explore it. But he's like, but I'm a physicist. I don't know anything about ants. So I said, well, it just so happens I do, and maybe we can work together on this. So long story short, we've struck up this collaboration where we are trying to understand not only what causes traffic jams, excuse me, I think we all have some theories about that, but what it is that ants specifically are doing so that they don't have traffic jams along those highways that I showed you pictures of earlier. So what we did, as you can see in this little video, is we went out to the field and we tried to create traffic jams for leafcutter ants by putting an obstacle in their path and then filming this and trying to see kind of what the response, not just of individual ants, but what is the collective response? How do these ants work together to get through this obstacle, right? And so here's a picture of us out there in the rainforest in Costa Rica, setting up our cameras along the path. This is a sidewalk for people, but the ants use it as well. They're actually walking right along. Here you can see little bits of green where they've dropped their leaves. So this is still an ongoing project, but what's interesting to note is that there is an immediate slowdown right where the obstacle is introduced. If I go back a slide, you can kind of see that there is a holdup here. By the way, there's two small slits here where the ants, like one ant at a time, can fit through. So we didn't block this completely. We just narrowed it substantially. And you can imagine, right, if this happened on 610 in Houston or something like that, it would be a slowdown for miles and miles and miles, right? But the ants don't have that backup. They just have this localized slowdown. The ants behind them don't respond, right? There's not a backup that extends further back. And so we're trying to understand what actually mediates this. So part of the answer seems to be their use of pheromones, right? If one ant finds the way through, it leaves a trail that lets the other ants know, hey, this is the best way through. And so, we're thinking about, are there lessons we can learn from this that we could maybe apply to the programs that, self-driving cars are going to be using when we get to a point where, self-driving cars might be the main way that people get around. We'll just program them to work like ants, right? Anyway, that's the idea, but it's a fun project. Oh, okay, I forgot I had this video. So this is looking straight down at, here's the barrier across the path, and it just sort of looks like chaos. But you can kind of see there's a localized slowdown here, but the ants further back don't really get affected. So ants don't have traffic jams. Certainly makes me jealous. Another project that I think you'll be able to recognize as being more applicable, perhaps to what's happening right around us here in Southeast Texas, is a project that looks specifically at the interactions between native and non-native ants in our region. And for this project, we're actually looking at the Big Thicket region, a little bit further east near Beaumont. And this is a project that started a number of years ago with my colleague, Tom Miller, and we were interested in particularly this one species of non-native ant called the tawny crazy ant, sometimes also known as the raspberry crazy ant. Its species name is Nylandaria fulva. And it's a recent arrival. It's only been here for about 15 years or so. Whereas the other non-native ant that everybody knows is the red imported fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, which was originally introduced from South America in about the 1930s into the port of Mobile, Alabama, and made its way into Texas, I believe, in the 70s. Anyway, so the impacts of fire ants are fairly well understood, but the impacts of Nylandaria fulva are much less well understood. But what we do know is concerning. So our goal initially was to try to kind of look at what the role of these crazy ants has been, and maybe get a sense of what happens when they arrive in a new place. So we thought we could get out ahead of the wave of these Nylandaria by looking sort of at the region where they already exist and spanning into the region where they don't yet exist. And that took us to the Big Thicket area. So what you're looking at is a map of the Big Thicket region, where the red stars are the different sampling locations that we followed over a span of a couple of years. And at each of these sites, we put a series of pitfall traps in the ground filled with a bit of soapy water, leave them out for a week, come back and collect them and see what you've got. So this is really nice because it gives us a way of repeating the same collection method over time. And so we did that continuously. Each of these green areas, by the way, is a separate unit of the Big Thicket National Preserve, which I imagine some of you are probably familiar with. So what we found was that if you look at the number of ant species, there's a little bit of variation between seasons. So we collected in late spring and in early fall, and we did that in 2014 and then again in 2015. Largely, we found that there was, a consistency for the most part from year to year. There wasn't like a huge amount of variation, a little bit from season to season, but not much from year to year. In other words, these communities appeared to be fairly stable. But one of the sites, well, a few of the sites actually, one in particular, we did find that Nylandaria fulva, the crazy ant, was present. And it was really remarkable to compare those few sites that did have that species with those that didn't. What we found is that in areas without crazy ants, there were a whole lot of different species present, including some, interesting and important native species. But where Nylandaria fulva was found, it was pretty much all that you found. It was amazing to see. There was almost nothing else there in terms of other species of ants. So that's the kind of thing that is really quite concerning. Now, that was the original plan, but then Hurricane Harvey hit, right? And as we all know, it was a devastating event for certainly for people, myself included. Our house was flooded and destroyed in Hurricane Harvey. But it was also a major ecological disaster, and we realized it gave us the opportunity to go back and look at those same sites after the flooding event, because all of our sites, for the most part, had been inundated by, in some cases, like 15 feet of water. So we were really curious, like what is the impact of that kind of a severe flooding on ants, and is it different for native ants versus non-native ants? So we went back to those same sites and did another year of collections, the same locations. And what we found is that right after Hurricane Harvey, in the fall of 2017, you'll recall it was late August of 2017 when Harvey hit, we did find a decrease in the number of ant species immediately after that. But by the next year, the ant communities had recovered. They basically found the same number of ant species as before Hurricane Harvey. And if we look at the breakdown between native and non-native ant species, so here we're looking at the percent of ant species that are invasive species, what we found is that before Hurricane Harvey, there was a pretty stable number. There was this big decline immediately afterwards, and then it quickly recovered. So we didn't see, interestingly enough, a big change in the percentage of ant species that were invasive following Hurricane Harvey. If we look at the breakdown by sites, like how many of these sites were invaded by particular types of invasive ants, like fire ants, we see the exact same pattern again, a dip right after Harvey, and then a recovery to the same number of, same percent of sites invaded by fire ants, and likewise with crazy ants. So the bottom line seems to be that these ant communities, unlike the human communities, were really pretty resilient in the face of this absolutely catastrophic flooding event. I have to admit, we were fairly surprised by this result. So I think one of the other takeaways here is that ants are incredibly resilient. And we don't yet fully understand how they do this. We probably are all aware that fire ants are able to form floating rafts. That's become a kind of a infamous aspect of fire ant biology, but that is something unusual and somewhat unique to fire ants. They actually come from a part of South America that regularly floods, and so they are well adapted to flooding conditions. So that aspect wasn't terribly surprising. It's a little unclear where exactly the crazy ants come from. It's South America, but we don't know exactly where in South America. So it was interesting to see that not just fire ants, but other species of ants, including some of the native species, seemed to do okay, even with that severe flooding. Just a couple more things I want to tell you about, and then I want to make sure I have some time for questions. But a thing that we discovered kind of by accident by working on ants in the Big Thicket region was this really amazing behavior of this one species of ant called Aphenogaster treaty. And we discovered this by placing baits out in just in the Big Thicket area. And there was a student at the time, it's actually not the student that's shown in the picture here, but what she noticed is that every time we had put honey baits out, that these ants would show up and then the honey would be all dirty. And I sort of jokingly said, like, wouldn't it be funny if they were just taking whatever those little bits of dirt are and like carting those back to the nest? And then we watched an ant show up, grab a piece of dirt, and carry it away. We were like, oh, what? What's going on here? So it turns out we were not the first people to observe this behavior, but it's not a very well understood behavior. So what these ants are doing is they are finding liquid sources of food like honey, could be nectar, and they are putting absorbent materials like dried bits of leaves or soil or sticks into that material, leaving it for a bit to let it soak it up like a sponge, and then they're carrying that material back to their nest and using that to feed their nest mates. So they're literally using tools in order to collect food. Yet another thing that we once thought was unique to humans. So I'm not going to walk you through all the details of this, but this student, Alice Gong, has been working with me on trying to understand a little bit more about this behavior. It's just not very well understood. And so we figured out how to collect this species of ant and keep them alive in the lab. And she took some video observations, performed some experiments where she manipulated this behavior. And one of the things that she found is that there seems to be an innate ability of some types of worker ants to use these tools more so than others. So within the colony, some individuals are more inclined to use tools to collect food than others. And it appears to be something that's ingrained within them, instinctual, rather than something that they just learn from the other ants. But as I said, we're still in the early days of understanding this behavior. So ants use tools. Simple tools, but tools nonetheless. Okay, so the last thing I want to tell you about here is, it's a project that's still ongoing and one that I'd love thoughts about, ways that we might be able to expand this if anyone has ideas. What we realized is that our ability to track these native and non-native ants is limited by the amount of time it takes to go out and do all those collections, right? And so it's great we can go and hit these sites again and again, but we really only get a small snapshot of what's happening right at those sites at that point in time. And we're also somewhat limited to areas that we have access to. So we've worked in the Big Thicket National Preserve because we have permits from the National Park Service to go and work there. But as we all know, so much of Texas is privately owned, and it makes it very difficult to get information about what's happening on private property. So we thought, why not use a community science approach, also known as a citizen science approach, where we can invite school kids to help us by making collections of ants in their yards or in a nearby park or wherever they have access. And so we first pioneered this. I was working with a student, Kyle Dickens, you see here, on just a pilot study. We worked with a school right in the heart of the Big Thicket region in the town of Kuntz. And basically, Kyle's project was to just figure out, is this going to work? And if so, what's the best way to make it work? So we tried a whole bunch of different ways to invite students to participate and collect ants for us. And we found that, in fact, it does work, and it works so well that we've now rolled it out in a larger way. And so this year, I have another student, Lily Stockseth, who is working with me on expanding this project to a lot more schools in the greater Houston region. So in the fall, we sent out 472 collection kits to 9 local elementary schools. And each of the kits was really very simple. It's just a note card with a piece of pecan sandies cookies, because that is the best ant bait, according to generations of ant biologists. And you place it on the ground for an hour, let it sit, and then basically grab it and stick it in a Ziploc bag, and then they send it back to us. We, put it in the freezer overnight. You don't want live ants, crawling out of your mail. But this is really interesting because it's a very effective way of getting a lot of information about what ants are found in a much wider region than we'd be able to do on our own. So in the fall, what Lily found is that this technique does indeed work. You can see on the map here the different sites where we had collections from students, and we collected a lot of ants. Yeah, there were more than 5,000 individual ants collected. Interestingly, only 2 individuals of the tawny crazy ant, Nylandaria fulva. And so that was really interesting and kind of surprising. So a lot of fire ants, and then the other ants, we didn't necessarily identify them to species. We were mostly focused on these 2 invasive species. But this semester, what we're doing as a follow-up is we've invited these schools to participate in another round of collections. It's actually taking place this week and last week. And what we've done is we also traveled to the same neighborhoods where the schools are, and we did our own set of collections. So we just completed this last Tuesday. And that is meant to give us a comparison, just to see, like in places where we don't find the students collecting Nylanderia fulva, does that mean they're not there? Or does it mean that for some reason those ants are harder for kids to collect? We just need a kind of a baseline comparison so that we can know that these data are useful. We think they are, but that's going to be really interesting to compare. So where I could use help from others, it would be in finding other schools that would be interested in participating in this project moving forward. Our idea is that if this project works, and we think it does, that we would love to expand this to include more schools, more students, and be something that we can repeat year after year so that we can continually monitor the presence of these invasive ants over time. So I'll just close by thanking the many people that I've worked with over the years, only a few of whom are shown in these images here, some of the organizations and funding agencies that have supported this work. And I'll leave you with this slide here, which provides links to a lot of different places where you can go to find more information about ants. Some of these amazing photos that you've seen here, including those on this page of ants by Alex Wild. There's also some information about my own research if you want to find out more about what I've done and do, including our community science project. I've got a website for that as well, and my contact info down here as well. So thank you very much. And if we have time, I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions.
Sure, Scott. We have a few questions, but before I forget, you might want to partner with in addition to schools, partner with the Texas Master Naturalists, because we have 50 chapters statewide, and we could get that approved at a state level to do research for your ant studies.
I love that idea. That would be fantastic.
So,
Thank you.
Sure. So first is a comment from Ron Masters. Glad to be cool. When it was hip to be hep, I was hep. Not sure what that has to do with ants, but Ron wanted that out there.
Yeah, and Ron shared a link to a really great article. If you don't mind, I'm going to put it in the chat for everybody on ants.
And next question is from Shannon Westvier. I have a question about C. discolor versus C. floridanus. I believe I have a colony. Shannon, do you want to elaborate?
I do. I mean, they look like floridanus to me, but now that I saw your pictures, I went back in my iNat and I was like, ooh, I think I might have I guess discolor is the species.
Yeah.
And
okay.
they only come around in the mid to late summer, around July, and then they're gone in September.
Okay, interesting.
And they're living in my house, so I should probably get that taken care of.
Yeah, it's carpenter ants. They'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question is from Della Barbato. Is there typically one queen per nest?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it actually varies by species. So in many ant species, yes. So for example, most leafcutter ants only have a single queen in a nest, including in those enormous nests that I showed you. There are some species, and actually the fire ants are one example where in some cases there can be multiple, in fact, many queens per colony. There's actually an interesting genetic mutation that's taken place within the red imported fire ants. Some of our local colonies have that mutation and some do not. If they have the mutation, they actually lose the ability to tell whether another worker ant of the same species belongs to their colony or not. And so they have basically two options. They can attack every ant they see, which obviously wouldn't last very long as a strategy, or they can accept every ant that they see. And so that's the strategy they've adopted. And that has resulted in them accepting multiple queens within the nest. It's actually one of the reasons why they're very difficult to kill, because of course you have to kill the queen to kill the colony, and that's hard to do when there are a lot of different queens in the nest.
Okay, next is a comment from Amy Fan. I hear those honeypot ants are popular treats among some indigenous peoples.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's honeypot ants in the Southwest U.S., some in Australia as well. And there may be, they're different types of ants actually, but they have independently evolved that lifestyle. And yeah, they are a food that has traditionally been eaten by people that are from those regions. And I have not tried them myself. I would love to. I love trying new foods and certainly include insects in that. I've eaten ants, but not those ants. I did hear a story once, though, of someone who there's an ant biologist who tried honeypot ants, and he said, unfortunately, he thinks they weren't foraging on nectar at that time. He's guessing it was roadkill. So, so that backfired a bit. But yes, they are edible.
Next is from Shannon Westbier, where crazy ants are well established through the effect of the red imported fire ant, positively or negatively.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one I didn't have time to get into. But yes, they do seem to be capable of displacing red imported fire ants, and it's really amazing because, as we all know, it's hard to displace red imported fire ants. One of the ways that crazy ants do this is they're actually able to neutralize fire ant venom using their formic acid that they produce. So the crazy ants don't have stingers like fire ants do. They produce formic acid. And that formic acid has the effect of neutralizing fire ant venom. So in these interactions that sometimes happen between fire ants and crazy ants, that can be a deciding factor. And so we've seen places where, like I showed you that, in the data that we've got, where you only see crazy ants. Now, we don't know what that community looked like prior to the arrival of crazy ants, but all the other areas around us, have diverse communities of ants. So we think that these crazy ants are able to displace not only the native ants, but fire ants as well, which is definitely cause for concern. I mean, people debate about whether you'd rather have the fire ants or the crazy ants, right? It's sort of like name your poison, but the impacts that they're having on native insects is very concerning.
Okay, next is from Paulo Komar. Can you explain how the zinc of the leafcutter ants work? Are their mandibles made of zinc? How do they ingest zinc to replace any they lose as they age?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually don't really fully know the answer to that. I don't know what aspect of their diet where they're acquiring zinc. That's a really interesting question. I wonder if it's present in the fungi, because that's their primary food. That would be my first place I would look. But in terms of where it's located, yeah. So basically, a component of their mandibles, of the part of the exoskeleton, in the mandible is zinc. It's not like pure zinc, but it's zinc is a component of the mandibles. So it's hardened, and it does wear down over time. So if you look at an older worker ant, you can see that that the mandibles are smoother. They're not as sharp and jagged anymore. But that zinc, I think, slows the erosion of the mandibles as they cut.
Okay, next is from Luke Kolb. We had raspberry crazy ants. We got them from a soil delivery. They killed off our fire ants and our leafcutter ants for 4 years, and last year they disappeared. We have fire ants again, but no leafcutters. Is this common?
That's actually a very interesting observation, because especially the fact that they disappeared. So I think the arrival of them coming with soil delivery, we know that that's one of the mechanisms by which they move is transport of soil and materials, and the fact that they then cause the elimination of fire ants and leafcutter ants is consistent with the kind of things that we've seen. But then the fact that they disappeared is especially interesting to me. So I'd actually love to follow up with Luke and find out a little bit more about when and where this happened, because we're wondering if we actually saw some sites where the crazy ants disappeared from our sites as well, and it's unclear if that's a temporary thing or if that's maybe they have this kind of boom bust life cycle. But that's part of what we're hoping we can capture with our community science project. So yeah, that's very interesting.
Okay, I'll send you Luke's contact information. So
Great. Yeah, thank you.
And I had a quick question. We have an ant pile right in the middle of our road on our 40-acre property here, and we're trying to protect it. We put up little red flags near it so we don't run over it. But we're going to be widening. We're going to be doing some road construction. They act like leaf cutters, but we never see them bringing anything back. We see them excavating from the hole all the time. They're fairly large. Is there a way to relocate an ant nest like that?
If it's a large nest, probably not. With a small nest, Possibly. I mean, the thing that you have to do, and especially if they are indeed leafcutter ants, what you have to do is move, of course, the queen, but also the fungus garden. And so if it's a large nest, you'd be looking at potentially, like hundreds of those chambers, and finding the queen is very, very difficult. So that would be hard to do. For younger nests, it's conceivable because it's smaller. You could be, confident that you've captured the whole colony and the queen in particular. But yeah, it'd be hard to do for a mature nest, unfortunately.
Okay. And I have a clarification. It was actually Tracy Kolb, not Luke Kolb. So I'll send you Tracy's contact information.
Okay, great.
Okay. And any other questions out there? Oh, I just got one from Cindy. Is it possible that the method of collection, ball versus water trap, plays a role in which species are collected? Could older students be taught other methods of collection to add variety in the data set?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's part of what we looked at in our initial pilot study. Was we looked at a couple of different types of collection. So we looked at having tubes where you just stick the lid on the tube, and that seemed like it would be maybe a little easier in some ways. But what we found is that it really didn't make a difference. So the note card versus the tube, it was basically the same in our pilot study. It didn't give us noticeably different data. Yeah, I'm trying to think. We tested something else too. I forgot what the other thing was that we looked at. So, and then in some of our other work, we've explored a wider variety of different types of collecting techniques. There can be differences, right? So pitfall traps are a great technique in that you get a wider range of ants, not just those that are attracted to that particular type of bait. But it's much trickier to do a pitfall trap, especially for somebody that's not trained in the technique, and it takes a long time, right? You have to come back at least a day later, and preferably a week later. So we've sort of gone for the baiting in part for the simplicity, but also because it seems to do a pretty good job of capturing the two species we're most interested in, the fire ants and crazy ants. So we have found that in places where those species are present, they show up, and we probably all have experiences with fire ants showing up faster than you would like, and with crazy ants, they actually come even faster than fire ants. So we think the technique is okay, but again, we'll find out whether our data match the data that the school kids collect pretty soon here.
Okay, I think that was the last question. So Scott, on behalf of our chapter, thanks so much for taking your time with us this evening, and it was an excellent talk.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it. Thanks for the great questions, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about ants.
Great, thank you. I'm turn it back over to Gary Moore, our Master of Ceremonies. Gary?
Yeah, if as you proceed with your work, if you come up with anything new or anything that you would like to share, please give us a call, because this is a very informative, and it's almost like sitting back in college. So we want to thank you, and hopefully we'll get to have you back soon.